Hi there. Power, money, and the first lie empires tell themselves. Napoleon Bonaparte ever stepped onto a battlefield, the conditions for his failure were already forming, not in France alone, but in the psychology of power itself. Because power has a pattern, it starts with survival, then expansion, then dominance, and finally, control. That last step is where things always go wrong. When leaders stop adapting to reality and start trying to force reality to adapt to them, decline has already begun, even if victory still looks impressive on the surface. Napoleon didn't invent this pattern. He inherited it. Let's start with something uncomfortable. Empires don't collapse because they are attacked. They collapse because they slowly begin to believe a lie about themselves. That lie sounds harmless at first. We are different. We are smarter. We have learned from history. This time the rules don't apply. Every empire says this, every single one, not loudly, not arrogantly at first, quietly, confidently, reasonably. And that's exactly why it works. Long before Napoleon, France, and the rot beneath the surface. To understand Napoleon, you have to understand the France he walked into. France before the revolution was already financially broken. The monarchy didn't collapse because of ideals alone, it collapsed because of debt, decades of war, extravagant spending, a tax system that crushed the poor while protecting the elite. By the late 1700s, France was drowning. The state borrowed relentlessly to maintain its image as a great power. Sound familiar? When borrowing no longer worked, the revolution arrived. Not as a clean solution, but as a violent reset. And resets are never stable. The revolutionary government tried to solve a structural problem with paper money. The assignats were introduced, currency backed by confiscated church lands. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it destroyed trust. They printed more, then far more than the economy could absorb. Inflation exploded, savings vanished, confidence evaporated. Money stopped being a store of value and became a symbol of chaos. This is the environment Napoleon emerged from. A country traumatized by instability. A population desperate for order. An economy technically alive, but psychologically wounded. Napoleon didn't just promise victory, he promised control. Napoleon, the reformer. History often jumps straight to Napoleon the Conqueror. That's a mistake. Napoleon first succeeded not with cannons, but with administration. He understood something deeply important. People don't follow leaders forever. They follow systems that feel stable, so he built systems. A centralized bureaucracy. A standardized legal framework, the Napoleonic Code. Reformed education, a professionalized military. And most importantly, he stabilized money. In 1800, Napoleon founded the Banque de France. This wasn't just a bank. It was a signal, a message to citizens and investors. There is order again. You can trust the system. And for a time, they could. This is where Napoleon's tragedy truly begins. Because early success doesn't teach humility. It teaches confidence. And confidence, when unchecked, becomes certainty. The first dangerous thought, I can manage this. Napoleon began to believe he could do more than rule France. He believed he could engineer Europe, not through cooperation, not through gradual alignment, but through control. This is the moment where leaders stop asking, what does the system want? And start asking, how do I make the system obey? Markets, trade, money. These are living systems. They respond to incentives, not commands. Napoleon didn't fully grasp that. He saw money as a lever, trade as a weapon, economics as an extension of warfare. That belief would lead directly to disaster. Britain, the enemy Napoleon misunderstood. Napoleon hated Britain, but not for emotional reasons. He respected British power, and he understood its source. Britain wasn't strong because of its army. France could defeat British forces on land repeatedly. Britain was strong because of trade, shipping routes, financial institutions, debt markets, confidence in British credit. Britain could lose battles and still finance wars. That terrified Napoleon. He believed, correctly that Britain's true battlefield was economic. But here's the mistake. He believed destroying trade would destroy trust. History shows the opposite. Trade adapts, trust migrates, capital flows around obstacles. Force doesn't stop it, it redirects it. Napoleon didn't see that yet. The Continental System, the beginning of overreach. In 1806, Napoleon introduced the Continental System. This wasn't just policy, it was an attempt to reshape reality. The idea was simple: cut Britain off from European markets, starve its economy, force submission without invasion. On paper it was brilliant, on paper everything is, but paper doesn't behave like people. European nations depended on British trade, merchants depended on British goods, consumers depended on British supply chains. So what happened? Smuggling exploded, corruption skyrocketed, local economies suffocated. Napoleon responded the only way centralized power ever responds: when reality resists. More enforcement, more punishment, more pressure. And that's how economic policy slowly turns into military necessity. The subtle shift from strategy to obsession. This is the moment historians often miss. Napoleon didn't wake up one day and decide to conquer everything. The system forced him forward. Every time a country resisted the Continental System, Napoleon faced a choice: adapt policy or enforce obedience. Adaptation would have meant admitting limits. Napoleon chose enforcement. That decision locked him into a path where retreat became psychologically impossible. Power doesn't like admitting mistakes, especially after years of success. A warning hidden in plain sight. By the time Napoleon looked east toward Russia, the warning signs were already there. Economic strain, political resentment, overextended logistics, quiet resistance. But here's the cruel part about history. Empires usually notice warning signs, they just interpret them wrong. Napoleon saw resistance not as a system rejecting his strategy, but as defiance that needed correction. That misinterpretation would cost him everything: Russia, winter, and the illusion of absolute control. By 1811, Napoleon was no longer fighting enemies. He was fighting consequences. This is an important distinction because consequences don't negotiate, don't surrender, and don't care how powerful you once were. They only arrive. Slowly at first, then all at once. Russia wasn't the plan. It was the result. One of the most common myths about Napoleon is that he wanted to invade Russia. He didn't, at least not at first. The invasion of Russia wasn't a bold masterstroke. It was the end result of a long chain of failed assumptions, each one forcing the next decision. This is how empires trap themselves. Napoleon's real objective was never Moscow. It was obedience. Russia, under Tsar Alexander IV, had initially cooperated with the Continental System. But cooperation came at a price. The Russian economy was bleeding. British goods were essential. Russian exports needed buyers. The blockade hurt Russia far more than Britain. So Russia did what rational actors always do when survival is threatened. It adjusted. Quietly, gradually, unofficially. Trade with Britain resumed through neutral ports and informal channels. Napoleon noticed. And this is where strategy crossed into psychology. The fatal interpretation: if I allow this, I lose everything. Napoleon interpreted Russia's behavior not as economic necessity, but as a challenge to his authority. This matters more than it sounds, because at this stage, Napoleon's power no longer rested only on armies. It rested on perception. If Russia could disobey the Continental System and survive, others would follow. Spain had already resisted. Portugal had defied him. Prussia and Austria were watching carefully. Napoleon faced a dilemma that every dominant power eventually faces. If enforcement fails once, the system collapses everywhere. So the question became, do you tolerate disobedience, or do you make an example? History tells us which option empires choose: overconfidence built on old victories. Napoleon didn't underestimate Russia because he was ignorant. He underestimated Russia because his past victories rewired his judgment. This is one of the most dangerous effects of prolonged success. Past wins start to feel like universal laws. Napoleon had defeated Austria, Prussia, coalitions of Europe, again and again. Every campaign reinforced the belief that speed, shock, and decisive battle would always work. But Russia wasn't playing the same game. Napoleon prepared for a war he understood, against an enemy who refused to fight it. The Grand Army, power at its peak. In 1812, Napoleon assembled the Grande Armée, over 600,000 men, not just French, but Italians, Germans, Poles, Dutch. On paper, this was Europe unified under Napoleon. In reality, it was Europe forced under Napoleon. Loyalty was thin, motivation uneven, supply chains stretched beyond logic. The army was massive and fragile. This is another imperial illusion. Big systems feel strong, but they are often brittle. The march east, where logic started to break. From the very beginning, the campaign showed cracks. Distances were underestimated. Roads were poor. Supplies failed to arrive on time. Napoleon assumed the war would be short, that the Russians would defend key cities, that a decisive battle would end it. The Russians refused. They retreated. They burned crops. They destroyed villages. They evacuated cities. This strategy wasn't heroic. It was brutal, but it was effective. Napoleon advanced and found nothing to conquer. No food, no shelter, no victory. Borodino, winning the wrong battle. Eventually, the Russians stood their ground at Borodino. It was one of the bloodiest battles in history. Napoleon won, technically. The Russians retreated. The field was his. But here's the problem. He didn't destroy the Russian army. He didn't break their will. He didn't end the war. He only confirmed that they were willing to bleed. Indefinitely. This was the moment Napoleon should have paused. He didn't. Moscow. The illusion of triumph. When Napoleon entered Moscow, he believed the campaign was over. He expected surrender, negotiation, submission. Instead, he found a city on fire. Moscow had been abandoned and burned by its own people. No supplies, no shelter, no government to negotiate with. Napoleon waited. Days turned into weeks. Winter approached. And this is where the legend of Napoleon defeated by winter oversimplifies the truth. Winter didn't defeat Napoleon. Delay did. Retreat, when systems collapse. When Napoleon finally ordered the retreat, it was too late. Supply lines were gone, horses were dead. Morale had collapsed. Cold finished what strategy had already destroyed. Soldiers froze, starved, deserted. Russian forces harassed the retreat relentlessly. Of the original 600,000 soldiers, fewer than 100,000 made it back. Some estimates put the number far lower. This wasn't just a military disaster. It was a psychological earthquake. The moment Europe stopped believing. Empires survive on belief. The moment belief cracks, power evaporates. After Russia, Napoleon was still alive, still ruling, still commanding armies. But Europe had seen the truth. He could be beaten. He could miscalculate. He could overreach. Coalitions reformed. Allies defected. Resistance hardened. The myth was gone. The deeper failure. Mistaking control for stability. Napoleon didn't lose in Russia because of snow, or distance, or Russian resilience alone. He lost because he believed control could replace cooperation. He believed economic systems could be commanded like armies, that loyalty could be enforced indefinitely, that complexity could be simplified through authority. History punishes that belief, every time. A pattern. Older than Napoleon, Rome tried to control trade through force. It collapsed. Spain tried to control wealth through silver. It collapsed. Napoleon tried to control Europe through economic isolation. It collapsed. The lesson is always the same. Systems don't obey power. They respond to incentives. When leaders stop listening to feedback, the system responds with failure. Collapse, debt, and why this story never ends. After Russia, Napoleon was still standing, but the system was dead. Here's something most history books gloss over. Napoleon didn't fall immediately after Russia. He was still emperor, still commanding armies, still issuing orders. On the surface, power remained. But underneath, something far more important had vanished. Credibility. Before 1812, Europe feared Napoleon. After 1812, Europe began to calculate Napoleon. And fear and calculation are not the same thing. Fear paralyzes. Calculation invites resistance. The domino effect, when control turns into contagion. The Russian disaster sent a signal across Europe. Not a message, a signal. Signals are harder to stop than messages. Prussia saw it, Austria saw it, Sweden saw it, and they all reached the same conclusion. Napoleon is no longer inevitable. Once that thought exists, the system is already breaking. Coalitions formed again, not out of loyalty to Britain, but out of opportunity. This is a recurring imperial pattern. Allies don't abandon you when you're weak. They abandon you when you're seen as weak. Leipzig, 1813. The battle that wasn't about tactics. The Battle of Leipzig is often called the Battle of Nations. And that name matters. Because Napoleon wasn't just fighting armies anymore. He was fighting momentum. Multiple nations, multiple fronts, multiple agendas. This is what happens when centralized power overstretches. Napoleon still fought brilliantly, still outmaneuvered enemies tactically, but tactics don't save collapsing systems. Leipzig wasn't lost because Napoleon forgot how to fight. It was lost because too many people had decided he shouldn't win. The financial reality: wars are won on ledgers. Here's the uncomfortable truth that emperors hate. Wars are not decided by bravery. They are decided by financing. Britain didn't beat Napoleon by fielding larger armies. It beat him by funding everyone else. Subsidies, loans, gold shipments. While Napoleon tried to control Europe through restriction, Britain kept Europe alive through liquidity. That difference matters. One system choked, the other flowed. Napoleon never fully adapted to modern financial warfare. His banking reforms were late, his credit system shallow, his state finances rigid. He ruled like a general in a world that was becoming run by accountants. 1814, Paris falls. Quietly. When Allied forces entered Paris in 1814, there was no epic final stand. No burning capital, no mass resistance. That silence tells you everything. The city didn't defend him because the system no longer believed in him. Napoleon abdicated, exile followed, and Europe exhaled. The mistake everyone misses. Exile didn't end the problem. Napoleon's exile to Elba is often framed as closure. It wasn't, because Napoleon wasn't the disease. He was a symptom. The disease was the belief that power alone could command economic reality. That belief didn't disappear with him, which is why he came back. The 100 Days, when the myth tried one last time. Napoleon's return in 1815 shocked Europe, not because he was strong, but because he was still symbolic. Soldiers rallied, crowds cheered, old loyalties flickered back to life. But something fundamental had changed. The system no longer supported the myth. No money, no time, no margin for error. And that brings us to Waterloo. Waterloo, losing the future, not the battle. Waterloo wasn't just a military defeat, it was a structural defeat. Napoleon faced an enemy that had learned coalition coordination, stable financing, clear objectives. He was fighting the past with the tools of yesterday. And when he lost, there was no recovery. This time, exile was permanent. St. Helena. The final irony. Napoleon spent his final years on St. Helena, isolated, guarded by Britain. The man who tried to isolate Britain from the world was himself isolated by Britain. History has a dark sense of humor. Napoleon insisted until the end. If I had more time, the system would have worked. But time wasn't the problem. The assumption was. The real lesson: systems always win. Here's the part that connects everything. Napoleon believed control could replace incentives, enforcement could replace trust, authority could replace adaptability. Systems don't work that way. Trade behaves like water. Capital behaves like electricity. Information behaves like pressure. Block it, and it finds another path. Always. And why this matters today. Now pause, look around, ask yourself, do we live in a world of free markets or a world of managed promises? Because today, money isn't backed by metal. Debt isn't temporary. Trust isn't guaranteed. It's assumed. Every modern currency is a promise. Every bond is a belief. Every system depends on confidence. And confidence is fragile. The quiet parallel. Napoleon didn't fall when he lost battles. He fell when debt outpaced control, enforcement replaced consent, complexity exceeded command. Sound familiar? This isn't a warning. It's a pattern. The final truth. This is not a conspiracy, not a secret cabal, not a hidden villain. It's something far more unsettling. A recurring human mistake, believing we can freeze systems in place when systems are alive. Napoleon tried, Rome tried, Spain tried, others will try again, because power forgets and history waits. Closing. Thought. History doesn't repeat itself loudly. It whispers first, and those who ignore the whisper eventually hear the crash. If this made you pause, good. That means you're listening. Hit like so more people hear the whisper. Subscribe if you want to keep decoding these patterns together. And tell me in the comments, do you think today's system is stable or just confident? I read every comment. See you in the next one.